Hey guys, it's Kevin in my review for Civil War. And this, of course, takes place in a futuristic dystopian world where basically the entire world has pretty much gone to shit. There is a civil war that has emerged across the entire United States. There are, states allying that you never would have expected them to before. But we are mainly centering around these journalists who have been chronicling the war, and they think that their next step in potentially, getting a perspective of how this war could maybe come to an end is by getting an interview from the president, who is really being looked at as a very controversial figure, and maybe get his insight on what's really going on. But in order to do that, they're going to have to make a very dangerous trek from New York City all the way to Washington, D.C. in order to obtain this interview and hopefully find a way to do so before this rebellion ends up taking over the city and potentially halting their entire journey, overall. So Civil War, I was honestly very conflicted with this film. On one hand, I thought that this had a lot of potential. I really love Alex Garland as a director. I think he has done a very good job of making some very unique and different sci-fi films and really bring a lot of different themes to them. I literally just rewatched Ex Machina, which I can say right now, I have no idea what the hell I was talking about when I first reviewed that movie. It is very much not the movie I said it was, but a very effective film for sure, and a very timely one, I think, as well, especially what it has to say about AI and humans coexisting and the idea of whether or not they can. I think the movie has a lot to say about that, but also kind of centering around this idea of trying to adapt to somebody else's standards and, individualism and things like that. There's so many things that film does so incredibly well. The point is, I've always really respected him as a director. I think he has such unique ideas, and even if sometimes his ideas didn't work out for me, like I really wasn't a big fan of his previous film, Men, I still really appreciate a lot of what he was trying to do. I really like the unique ideas he brought to that film. I thought he had a very interesting sort of vision. So when it came to Civil War, I was just really hoping he would have a different and interesting take on this film, but I was also very conflicted because I feel like a movie like this, it's very hard to make without it completely becoming this utter train wreck. I thought that, I was really hoping this film would find that sweet spot between being a very effective social commentary, but also not coming across in a way that felt exploitative or a way that felt, tone deaf. I was just really hoping this film could strike that right balance. So I was rooting for it, but the marketing just had me very conflicted on how to overall feel. But I'm happy to report that Civil War honestly exceeded my expectations. This is an extremely effective and frequently chilling look at just the dangers of war, but also setting a lot about like the dehumanization and things like that. And it's a much more effective and compelling film than I've really expected it to be. And we're just getting into right now, starting off with the cast here. And when it comes to Alex Garland's projects, that is something that is going to deliver no matter what the film is. I think every project he has dabbled in, I have been impressed by the performances. I think everyone, it's usually very well cast. He's very good when it comes to, finding the right group of actors. And that really continues to be the case when it comes to Civil War. I was very impressed by the entire cast here. I think they really do end up carrying this film. I think they're one of the strongest elements of this film by far. Let's first talk about Kirsten Dunst, who, I've said it before, I think she's one of the best actresses working today. She's so incredibly subtle, and always, exudes these very quiet and subtle emotions, but that's why she's so effective. She's one of those actresses where you can just look at her face and you know exactly what she's feeling at every second. Hell, I just rewatched the first two Spider-Mans last month, and just those movies alone, you can tell how strong of an actress she is, and she really has only gotten better, I think, as she has gone on in her career. And this is by far one of her best performances yet, playing this character of Lee Smith, someone who, she's been around for a long time doing, journalism for war and things like that. And, she's someone who has had to detach herself from her emotions, but you can see how increasingly harder that gets throughout the film. There are moments where you can tell she is feeling she is feeling dread. She is feeling sadness over what's going on, but yet has to do what she can to mask it. And her struggle to maintain that throughout the film, that's really what draws you to her character, and Dunst just perfectly understood that throughout this movie. I thought she just did a fantastic job in this film, especially towards the third act of this movie. She really has some incredible moments, and I think just gives one of her most effective performances to date. A lot of it without the use of dialogue. I was just really impressed by what she ended up accomplishing here. But honestly, I think the standout of this entire movie, if you really had to ask me, is Cailee Spaeny, who plays Jessie, who, listen, I've always been a huge fan of her. I've always think that she, has given really strong performances, but she's just really been taking off lately. I think since Devs, she has just been giving amazing performance after amazing performance, and this is yet another one, because Jessie is basically the polar opposite of Lee. She is brand new to the world of war journalism, but yet she has aspirations to become this photographer of sorts, and she doesn't fully know what she's getting herself into, and you see throughout the film how this starts to affect her more and more, and how she kind of evolves throughout the movie. I just thought she just did such a incredible job. She kind of is the audience throughout the film, like the way you're feeling, Jessie is likely feeling, and that's what really kind of connects you to her character in that way, and I thought that she worked really well as such. I really enjoyed her performance in this film. I thought she by far had some of the most emotional moments, and I just really liked what she ended up doing here, so I thought she gave a really strong performance. Wagner Moura also is very good here as Joel, who is this colleague of sorts to Lee. I thought he gave a really strong performance, unexpectedly too. Like there's one moment in the film that he had that I didn't see coming, because he was giving a mostly restrained performance, but there's one moment where he really kind of lets loose, and you see how he's feeling, and I thought his performance was really well done. I was really impressed by him. McKinley Henderson always is great in everything, but I really enjoyed his role in this film. He's like a mentor to all of the journalists, kind of like this father figure of sorts, and he kind of provides this heart to the movie that I think otherwise just really wouldn't be there, but also kind of providing some unexpected comedic relief that I really enjoyed as well. I really just enjoyed what he ended up doing in this film. I thought he was just really great here. I've always enjoyed him in films, but I think this was a really strong performance from him. So I think those four, those really are the four leads in this movie. They all do a really good job, but everyone else is also really good. Nick Offerman, for the limited screen time that he has, is really great here. It's just this really corrupt president that just keeps making the worst possible decisions and has really become this like tyrannical leader of sorts, and you really see like how much he is in fear of his life throughout this movie, and I thought that he just did a really good job here. But I gotta, of course, highlight Jesse Plemons in this movie, who, yes, only has like 5 minutes of screen time. I'm sure you've heard that in every single review, but yet this is the perfect example of doing so much with so little. That is what Plemons does so incredibly well here. We really don't know anything about the character that he's playing, but yet we are so intimidated by him just for the moment that he has. We're so on edge and scared of what could potentially happen. This movie has moments that, has countless moments that had me just on the edge of my seat, had me horrified of what was going on. But I don't think I was ever as tensed up or as glued to my seat as I was with Jesse Plemons' character. And it really is just the perfect example of what he does well as an actor, taking this character that could have honestly just been a throwaway role and really making him one of the most memorable of the entire film, with just how imposing of a threat he really is. But overall, everyone does a really great job. I think all the performances are really strong here, and easily one of the most consistent elements of this film. Alright, so now we gotta get to the directing and the writing, which the directing is more or less the most controversial element of this movie, which, I guess I understand to an extent. I think when you hear about a movie about, a war that has escalated, immediately you think, okay, it's gonna take some kind of side politically, and that's the big thing with this movie, is that Garland really chose not to do that, and I think that is to this film's benefit, considering what this movie is really all about. This is not a movie about the cause of the war or why this happened or how we can prevent it. No, instead, he really ends up taking this stance of just simply being anti-war. And I think that's what works so well in this movie, is just the way this is presented. It feels very authentic. It feels very real. It feels like this is a scenario that could eventually end up happening. And that is why it is so incredibly effective. I mean, this entire film just has you so on edge throughout, but also really escalates in tension throughout. They show you scenes of the war, but you really don't feel like you're in the thick of things until you do. It really feels like you're alongside these characters throughout the entire thing, and I think that's what Garland did so incredibly well in this movie. He could have easily taken this stance in this movie, and I wouldn't blame him for doing so. I think that is something that you would have expected him to do, but I think the fact that he doesn't take a stance, I think that actually makes this film that much more effective. I think the fact that he doesn't try to pick a side in this movie necessarily, I think that actually ends up being to this film's benefit, because instead he's just trying to present the situation as it is, and I think that is something that is way more effective in conveying the war as he does, in that it doesn't necessarily matter what the reason was. It doesn't necessarily matter how this all started. It's more so about just the fact that it is happening. It's terrifying to think about. Like, I think just the scenario alone is alone is very frightening to think about, and I think that's something that he just did a really great job with. Easily, the way he's able to build tension in this movie, I mean, he really just goes all out in creating that. But what I also appreciate about his directing is that it can sometimes be a bit stripped down. The movie is actually very character focused, and there are just as many moments on these quieter moments as there are these big set pieces. This is in no way an action movie. Like, yes, there are, some very tense sequences, but they're not nearly as consistent as you think, and I think that really does work to this film's benefit, because it really just happens when you're least expecting it to, and I think it works that much more as a result. It really just feels like we're with these characters throughout this whole thing, and I was just really impressed by the way he decided to go about it. I actually think it's some of his most impressive directing to date. I just really like the way he ended up going about it. Garland has said this might potentially be his last movie, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad one to end on. I think that this film really demonstrates a lot of what he does well, the way he's able to craft suspense, the way he's able to still, have these really effective moments, but also insert some really interesting social commentary. I'll talk about that when it comes to the writing. I think he does a really great job with. So yeah, overall, I think it's some of his best directing that he's done to date, but the same goes for the writing here, because the thing that I really appreciate about this movie and what it really is about at the end of the day, the whole movie really is this study about journalism and why, what journalists have to consistently do, how they are supposed to simply just report on what's happening. And that is the objective for these characters. That is the mission that they are thrust into. They are taking these photos as a way to inform others of what is going on. And yet you can see how difficult that is for them. They have been trained to do this, but yet they don't necessarily want to, but they also know that they have to. They have to tell this story. They have to do what they can to authentically convey it, so people years from now know what's happened. And in that way, the movie is a lot more refreshing. I mean, how many times have we seen a movie through the eyes of, the soldiers, or through the eyes of the political people in power? All the time. Like, most war movies you can think of, they're usually through one of those two lenses. We normally don't get to see it through the perspective of journalists, but this movie really just shows the tireless efforts that they go through to depict the horrors of what's going on, but also how much they are struggling to overcome those emotions, how much they are struggling to mask their true feelings for what is going on. They have to remain stone-faced throughout this movie. There are many moments where they are struggling with that, and I think that that's something this movie just does such a great job with, is give us some insight into a part of a war that we really haven't thought about before and how it would really affect them. I think it makes the film that much more powerful as a result, and it makes it feel that much more fresh and unique to other films of its kind. And this is really where we get to why I think that apolitical stance is the way to go in this movie, because we're following journalists around the entire movie. The whole movie is framed from their perspective, and they are kind of in this, industry where they have to detach themselves from experiences. They're not supposed to insert their own opinions or draw their own conclusions. They are just supposed to simply report on what's happening, and it makes the film that much more effective as a result, because you can see how difficult it is for these characters to continue being objective. Someone like Kirsten Dunst's character, for example. I mean, she's done this pretty much all of her life. She, early on in the movie, Cailee Spaany's character talks about how she was, famous for doing this, this whole thing in college about Antifa and things like that, and she is really praising her for it, and you can see that she has become very cold as a result. She doesn't want to show a lot of emotion, but yet you can tell that this is getting that much more difficult for her, especially seeing someone like Jessie, who isn't experienced with this kind of thing. She wants to become a photographer, but she doesn't understand the harsh reality of what she's getting herself into. She doesn't understand what is at the cost of her doing that. And she herself has this optimistic sort of nature about her, while all these other characters are very apathetic, and they've kind of, they have this dread to them, recognizing the severity of the situation. She really doesn't. She sees this as an opportunity to, get this interview. She sees this opportunity to kind of get her feet wet and really, go alongside this trip with who has been her hero all this time. And you really end up feeling for her character as a result, because you understand just, she doesn't really recognize what she's getting herself into. She sees this simply as just something she can partake in that might be, that might boost her career. She doesn't realize how dangerous this really is. And you can see how hard it is for her to do that in this movie. She makes a ton of reckless decisions in this film. And I've seen some people take issue with this in the movie, but I really didn't, because it makes sense for her character to do that. She's not someone who's always going to make the most sound decisions, because she doesn't really understand what she's getting herself involved in. She doesn't understand how bad the war has gotten. Yes, it is bad in this particular side of the world, but it is so much worse around this part of the United States. And I think that's something this movie depicts really well, is just seeing these characters thrust into more, increasingly more danger as the film goes on. It starts off and, you think that this is as bad as it's going to get, but then they go to this other location, okay, this is as bad as it's going to get. Then they go to this other location, you think this is as bad as it's going to get. So the film keeps escalating the stakes in a way that really gets you to understand how harder it is for these characters to detach from their emotions, and how much harder it is for them to continue to not react to what is going on. I think it makes for a far more compelling and thrilling story as a result. All the characters, in fact, I really did find myself drawn to, despite the fact that, like I said, a lot of these characters have to increasingly hide their emotions. They do a really good job of developing them as a result. When it comes to Stephen McKinley Henderson's character, I really enjoy the relationship he has with Lee in particular. I thought it was really sweet. You understand that he has kind of been in Lee's position before, and Lee has also been in Jessie's position before, and how hard it is for her to continue to, how hard it is for her to simultaneously continue on this mission as is, but also try to protect Jessie. And you see that Sammy's in a similar position, because he is this, he's this veteran journalist of sorts. He's seen it all. He knows exactly what they're getting themselves into, and the way that he is constantly trying to caution Lee about what's happening. I mean, I found his character to be one of the best of the entire movie. I really enjoyed the relationship that those two ended up sharing, and made for some of the most, I think, poignant moments of the entire film. The character of Joel, I will say at first I kind of had a hard time connecting to, but he has this one moment in the third act of the movie when a certain event ends up going down, and it really got me to understand his character. I thought they did some really great work with him. I really enjoyed his arc throughout this movie, and I just really loved what they were trying to do with him. I can't really get into it too much because it involves a pretty big spoiler, but there is a direction they end up taking with his character, and I thought that it really pointed a very interesting sort of question in the film, and I thought that's something that they did a really good job with. And I think the real point this movie is trying to make at the end of the day is this all worth it? Is it worth, going into this dangerous landscape just to get an interview with the president? Is it really worth it when the entire country has gone to shit? Is it worth it when we know exactly the peril we're going to get ourselves into? These characters don't know if they're going to survive the day, but yet they are so determined. They are so they are so fixated on making sure that this interview ends up happening. They're not letting anything get in their way, but the film is constantly posing the question of, should that be the case? Should they just retreat and, go about their day and just continue, depicting their city and things like that? Is it really worth it to continue doing that? And I think this movie does a really good job of diving headfirst into that question overall. But I also just really liked how much this film zeroed in on the relationships between these characters. When it comes to Lee and Jesse, for example, I really loved how much their relationship evolved throughout the film. Lee is constantly trying to not get attached to Jesse. She knows that Jesse is someone that is a rookie. She doesn't really know what she's getting herself involved in, whereas Lee does know the horrors of what could happen, and as a result, she knows that some of them might not make it through this, and she's trying to do what she can to not get attached to her. But throughout the film, they really start to develop a closer relationship. There's this scene on the bleachers, especially, when we kind of get some insight into Lee's past and what she's had to go through, and kind of just the effort she has made to get to the point that she's at, and kind of seeing the juxtaposing that to Jesse, who doesn't have that experience. And it really gets us to underscore this relationship and how much and how different these two are, but also how much they feel indebted to one another as a result. And I thought that it really just made the film that much more impactful as a result. I really found myself drawn to both of these characters and hoping that throughout all of this, they were going to be able to survive, especially when we see, like I said, the relationship that they're forming throughout the movie. You really do find yourself latching onto them, and I thought they just did such an incredible job with that. It would have been really easy to just present these characters as simply just like journalists who have no emotions, but yet the movie is doing everything it possibly can to get us to understand these characters and recognize why they have to act the way that they do, and I thought they did a really good job with that. Only were you invested in this movie because of the situation, but I also found myself really, not only was I invested in this film because of the situation, but I also found myself really attached to these characters. I really found myself wanting to see them make it through this, even if I didn't think they were making the most sound of decisions. At the end of the day, I cared about the relationships that they had formed. I cared about the bonds that we see in this movie, and I think those are some of the strongest sequences within this entire film. I also love the way this film really depicted the various locations these characters end up happening upon, because sometimes it seems like things are okay. There are places that they, come upon that maybe aren't as affected by the war. But then there are places where the war has fully broken out and it has basically destroyed any semblance of, normalcy. And it is militarized, state in a way that nobody would have ever expected. And it just felt so deeply authentic. It really does seem like Garland took his time in thinking about what would really happen in this scenario. What would the world look like if suddenly the entire United States ended up going to war? How would that really be depicted? You can tell he really was meticulous in making sure he crafted this in the most authentic way possible, and I think he just did a really good job with that. Some of the best scenes in this movie are just seeing these characters, maneuver through all these different locations and trying to do what they can to weasel their way out of it. There's a sequence in the first act in particular involving this town that it's just like constant warfare breaking out, and you can see these characters doing what they can to try to protect themselves, but you realize how difficult that must be. And I thought that, they just did Garland just did a really really great job at conveying just how terrifying of a situation this really is, and you really just find yourself thrust into this environment alongside these characters, and I just thought he did a really great job at depicting that. By far, though, I think the most memorable scene of this film that really everyone's going to be talking about is the Jesse Plemons scene, which I really can't say too much of, but what I will say is that the movie already was very, like, anxiety-inducing and really had me on edge. This scene ratcheted up to a level that I just was not prepared for, and is easily one of the most spine-tingling moments of any movie I have seen in a very long time. The places that it's going, the what it was trying to convey, the ideas that it was trying to present, they did such a great job of showcasing just how terrifying this world is, but also how lawless so much of the world had become. I thought they did such a great job with depicting that in this scene. And scenes like that, I mean, it's really just an example of what this film is trying to do at its best. So despite the fact that it is relatively simplistic, it is a very effective screenplay overall that I think is easily one of the most riveting of any that I have seen this year. But we gotta talk about the cinematography here by Rob Hardy, which is nothing short of masterful. I mean, this is A24's biggest film budget-wise, and it really does show. I mean, it really just feels like they did everything they could to make this seem as real as possible, to the point where, and other people have mentioned this, it does feel like a documentary at points. It does feel like you are watching this movie and this scenario is happening, you know, in the real world. You forget that this is just a movie because of how just immersive so much of this really does feel. It feels like they're really just trying to portray this in as realistic of a manner as they possibly could, and they really just do a great job with that. There are some scenes in this movie where, I mean, you are right in the thick of it. You see all of the carnage, all of the mayhem that's always going on, and those are easily some of the most frightening scenes in the entire film. And the way that Hardy went about, that I thought was just so incredibly well done. I mean, this movie really just holds nothing back in just showing just how incredibly just terrifying so much of this is. The violence that has escalated, you know, seeing it continue to just drone on and on and on, simply with seemingly no end in sight. Those scenes, especially in the third act of this movie, I mean, it is just relentless in terms of what it is showing you, and there are so many things you don't want to see in this film, but you do, and it's just like any sort of war that's going on, that you don't want to see certain things, but yet you have to see just how dangerous this has gotten. You just have to see how serious this has gotten to really understand the point this movie is trying to make about war and what it's really trying to convey about all of this. And I think that Hardy did a great job of really just amplifying the tension of this movie. Did a great job with that overall. Gotta talk about the score in this film. Very minimal. Not much of a score here. When it does play, it is very effective, but there really isn't much of one. A lot of the movie is based around a soundtrack of sorts, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but the needle drops that they use that are effective, I was surprised by how well they worked in the film. The opening sequence in particular used this on, and I really didn't know how it was going to work, but it really did end up working well. I think it's probably one of the most memorable sequences of the entire movie. The way it sets up everything, I was just really impressed by. But the thing I have to talk about that I don't think I've talked about enough in reviews lately is the sound design of this movie, because holy shit, it is some of the most visceral and just roaring that I have heard in any movie in such a long time. Every single gunshot, every single bit you see of the chaos that's going on, I mean, you feel every single second of it. There was one sound in particular involving this plane, and it might be the loudest thing I have ever heard in any movie I've seen. I saw this in Dolby, and my God, I mean, the way they just, again, immersed you into what was going on was just so impressive. It really just feels like you are just thrust right into this environment that you don't want to be in, but yet you also can't look away from, just because of just how shocked you are at what's going on. There were points in this movie where I felt like I had seen it all, and then the movie was just really showing me things that I wasn't expecting to see. The movie really doesn't hold back in just depicting the chaos that's going on and just how incredibly unsafe and just how incredibly dangerous things have really gotten. But especially in the third act, I mean, this movie really just goes all out in showing just how dire of a situation this has become, how much disarray the world has really gone into. I thought they did just a really great job with that overall. I was really impressed by so much of the sound design in this movie, and every scene of mayhem in this film. I mean, it really just ends up sending chills down your spine in a way that you are not prepared for, and I think that's what they do such a great job with in this movie, because the battle sequences, they're not consistent in this movie. They really do come in quick bursts. The movie is so much more effectively scary in that way. It honestly presents this in this horrifying, sort of scenario, and I think the movie is so much more chilling as a result. And the editing, I thought this movie was honestly perfectly paced. I thought they did a really good job of, slowly introducing us to everything, but then quickly just getting us into the thick of things. It really doesn't take too much time for us to go alongside this road trip of sorts and go, along this ride. And I thought everything was just really well paced in this movie. I really just found myself so invested in what was going on. There is a second to breathe, but yet you always have that fear of feeling like something could happen at any second. And I thought that, the way this movie was edited was just so incredibly well done. It had this very propulsive nature to it that I thought was just really impressive. So I thought that was just really well handled in this movie. And the way the movie ended as well, I really was surprised by. I did not expect them to go in the direction that they did. But I thought it really made sense for the story that they were trying to tell. I thought that the way the movie ended, it kind of brought this whole new meaning to the film that I thought was just really stuck with me, really ends up becoming something striking, and I thought they just did a really good job with that. So a lot of things work really well in this movie. I think it's very effective in a lot of the things it's trying to convey. Are there any issues with this film? Well, for me, there are a couple things that do bring it down. First of all, I talked about before how I think this film is benefited by the fact that it doesn't really try to take a stance, and I do stick by that. I think the fact that the movie has this apolitical sort of nature to it and is way more about, presenting this event and wanting you to draw your own conclusions, I think that is pretty effective. But there are some things I just wanted a little bit more clarity on. Maybe just give me more of a reason as to why this happened, or maybe present each side and kind of give us an idea of why they think it happened. I think that would have made it a little bit better, because sometimes I just feel a little bit disconnected on what's going on. There's some things here that just feel a little bit unbelievable, and I think if we got a little bit more clarification, it would have made it that much more effective. And also, there is this angle they take with the president in this movie as well, and I just felt we need a little bit more of him. You get the sense that he's like this really tyrannical leader. He's not really blaming himself for any of what's going on. What I will say is that what you've seen with Nick Offerman in the trailer, that's basically all you get with him in this movie. There's one additional scene with him beyond that, but you really don't get all that much more with him, and I just feel like they needed to do a little bit more with his character. Maybe even cut back to him. I'm not saying you need to cut back to him every so often, maybe hear him on the radio or something like that. A character watches a video of him or something. I just feel like we need a little bit more with him, because I just didn't really feel like I understood a lot of... I understood on a surface level what they were trying to go for, but I really feel like they could have leaned a bit heavier into some of the ideas with him, and they just really didn't. And maybe that would have involved Garland taking more of a stance in this movie. I understand that. I just feel that there are some things that just needed a bit more clarity. Some things just feel a little too vague in this film, and I think if Garland was to dive a bit deeper into it, the film would have been that much more powerful in what it was really trying to convey. So that's really one of my only issues. And the only other issue I do have with this movie is I talked about how the film uses a lot of different needle drops here throughout the movie, and sometimes the use of those needle drops didn't really fit with what was going on. In fact, sometimes it honestly diffused some of the tension and took me out of the movie. There was one choice in particular where I was like, yeah, this doesn't really fit at all. I don't really understand why they used this song at this particular point. I think this would be more effective if they either didn't use a score or, had a score here or just didn't use one at all. It just felt like they were trying to do something clever, and most of the time it worked, but this one time it really didn't, and it kind of took me out of the scene. But other than that, I mean, this film is extremely effective in what it is trying to convey. It has 4 really strong performances that really just end up anchoring this film, but also really getting you attached to these characters who themselves have had to emotionally attach from this situation and have such a hard time of doing so. But Cailee Spaeny especially giving, I think, the strongest performance in this movie, playing this character that is so unaware of what she's getting herself into and becomes so much and really just transforms as a result and becomes such a compelling character to watch. Some incredibly immersive cinematography that really just throws you into this nightmare scenario, but also presents you with a lot of interesting questions as to the necessity of this happening and whether and what really would occur if this situation were to happen, really just taking that to full advantage and doing a great job in doing so. And in that way, I think Civil War did all it was really trying to accomplish. I think Alex Garland went in and he wanted to make this movie that is just simply presenting this scenario, and it's trying to show just how dire and how, terrifying so much of this can be, and this idea about, the dehumanization and this escalating tension that happens throughout the movie. I think all of that is just so well conveyed that I really was just so blown away by what this movie was able to do. It was far better than I expected to be, and it honestly does end up being, I think, one of the most effective films of the entire year. If you're looking for a movie that is going to present this one particular side and it's going to tell this, story that is going to align with exactly what you want it to be, that's not really what Civil War is. But if you want a movie that presents this scenario in a way that feels plausible and feels very hyper-realistic and terrifying, I think Civil War is absolutely going to satisfy you with just how effective and how chilling so much of it really is. I honestly was just really blown away by what this film was able to do. It was certainly a much different movie than I was expecting, but I think it honestly turns out to be a better film as a result. It might not do everything right, and there are a couple things that I need a little bit more clarity on with how exactly it made sense in the grand scheme of things, but for the most part, I think this film was extremely effective in what it was trying to convey, and so as a result, I really don't have too many complaints with this one. I think it's yet another fantastic effort from Alex Garland. Just shows how much of how well he does with crafting suspense, but also really challenging himself and telling a different story than he has before, and I really just love how he was able to do that here. Overall, I think this film was just extremely effective in what it was trying to convey, and I'm going to give Civil War overall an A-. It's also just really great to see a movie that is original, that isn't based on any previous IP, have this big of a budget and be able to utilize it to its fullest potential. It really just gives me hope that A24 is really going to continue making films like this, that they're going to be able to continue, that they're going to, this film for the most part was successful, so I hope that they're able to reap the benefits of this and they're able to just build off of it and continue to make big budget movies that also still feel grounded in nature, still feel like they have these really well realized characters and these really well realized environments, and put just as much effort into those set pieces as they do in building character moments, in those quieter moments. I hope the movie does. I hope that that's something that A24 is able to continue to excel at, because between this and Everything Everywhere, they are just really killing it as a studio, and I just am just really pleased how far they have come overall. But over, guys, in my review of Civil War. Let me know what you guys saw of this movie overall. Left your thoughts, and we'll see you guys in my next video, and I will see you guys for that. Okay, bye.